There once was a man on Briar Lane. Nobody knew who he was. He was just another homeless bum to most, an ugly blemish on an otherwise picture-perfect suburban neighborhood. Everyone collectively seemed to avert their gaze whenever they found themselves walking down Briar Lane. They would stick to the opposite sidewalk and hastily trot along their way like he wasn't there. I was guilty of doing the same for many years. As a child, I was taught that it was rude to stare, but every time I turned a corner to Briar Lane, I would steal glimpses at the man. He was a disheveled, rugged man who looked to be in his 50s. He was kept warm by his unkempt graying beard, a thick, weathered wool jacket, a frayed beanie, and cargo pants with a number of small holes torn into them. His eyes never met mine, but I noticed his piercing blue eyes hidden behind an exhausted demeanor. He looked like any other homeless man, except for the eye patch he had, which I found rather amusing when I was younger. He must have been a pirate resting after a long voyage at sea, I thought. I always made sure to look away and stare straight whenever I got close, fearing he would notice my eyes linger on him for a split moment. I didn't want to initiate any interaction of any sort with the man. Not that he had done anything wrong. He never begged for spare change or bothered anyone asking for help. He only ever just sat on the concrete sidewalk and leaned against the brick wall. I never saw him eat or drink or do much of anything. He sat in silence, alone, every day, on Briar Lane. I'm not sure when the man on Briar Lane first piqued my curiosity. He was mysterious, to say the least, and that had a certain allure. It wasn't a full-on obsession, but I would catch myself wondering in the back of my mind about the life the man led. Not how he ended up on the streets, but the life experience he had that molded him into this cold, distant man. The betrayals, the losses, and the constant struggle for survival. What must have shaped him into someone so disconnected, wallowing alone in his small corner of the world, clinging on to the remaining warmth that was left within after a lifetime of hardship? What was it that brought him to that particular street, and why was it that he chose to rest? What made him the man on Briar Lane? The first time I spoke to the man on Briar Lane was when I was 14. I stopped by a convenience store on my way home from school with a few friends. It was our usual after-school hangout joint. We bought the usual snacks our parents warned us to go easy on and tried convincing each other to spend our allowances gambling on Pokemon booster packs. I would have given in to the peer pressure, but a pestering voice, perhaps the angel on my shoulder, reminded me of the man on Briar Lane. I ended up leaving the convenience store with a bag of chips, a bottle of water, and one of those questionable hot dogs wrapped in tinfoil. Briar Lane was along my way home, so I didn't need to take a detour. Before I even made the corner, I could already visualize the man sitting, slumped against the wall as he always was. I walked down Briar Lane, and for the first time, I made my way down his side of the road. I remember it was rather disorienting, like sleeping on a different side of the bed. It just seemed wrong to see things from a new perspective. As I drew near, I could feel my heart beating rather quickly. It was the same kind of nervousness one might feel when introducing themselves to a stranger. I assumed our eyes would meet as soon as he noticed I was headed towards him, yet his eyes remained fixed on the opposite side of the lane. I stopped in front of him, standing right in front of his field of view. Still, he refused to acknowledge my existence. I didn't think it was rude of him at the time, just odd. His sunken eyes red of exhaustion and defeat. I bent down slightly and held out the bottled water and tinfoil-wrapped hot dog. I had gotten a bag of chips for myself, but at that moment it didn't feel right to withhold it from him, and so I offered it to him as well. For the first time, the man slightly tilted his head upwards so that his eyes met mine. Slowly, he lifted his right hand from out of his jacket pocket. He was missing his thumb, his middle, and pinky finger. On the back of his palm was a large, dark patch of skin, either a birthmark or some disgusting stain. With speed and strength greater than I thought he was capable of, he swatted the items I offered away, knocking them onto the ground. Startled, I flinched and stumbled back, failing to find my footing. I landed hard on the concrete floor, now leveled with the man on the ground. He glared at me with white-hot intensity in his eyes. He began to raise his left arm, taking his hand out of his jacket pocket. I thought he was reaching to grab me, but there was nothing but a stump where his hand should have been. My instincts finally kicked in, and without wasting a second, I scrambled onto my feet, fleeing from the man. I didn't hear any footsteps in pursuit. I reached the end of the lane and finally risked turning around to see the man, still sitting exactly where he was, his eyes locked on me. I ran the rest of the way home. For the next few years, I took any detours I needed to, however inconvenient, just to avoid the man on Briar Lane. The next time I would encounter the man on Briar Lane would be when I was 18, coming back home after studying at my university abroad. I had all but forgotten about the scare I experienced with the man, forgotten that I made a vow to never walk down Briar Lane. It was evening, and the sun sat gently upon the horizon, casting an orange to purple gradient across the sky. I remember it was rather beautiful and mesmerizing. The intense feeling of nostalgia struck as details of my walk home as a child bombarded me. Details such as a stop sign that was just slightly bent, left making it seem like a sheepish suggestion. Then a familiar crack in the concrete I always thought resembled a dog's face. I came across a rather depressing sight of the same convenience store I used to frequent in my youth, now closed down and abandoned. Vines and weeds had begun overtaking the structure, and then finally, I turned the corner onto Briar Lane. It wasn't until I saw him that the memory of our last encounter surfaced again. I almost couldn't believe it, but there he was, visibly older and more worn down, but still sat in the same position and in the same spot. I almost considered taking a detour to avoid him. At that moment, I felt like the scared child I was all those years ago. However, the rational part of me assured myself that I had nothing to fear. He was merely a man down on his luck. It was pity I should have felt, so I proceeded down Briar Lane, and as usual, he didn't acknowledge my presence. I didn't plan on it, but I had an unopened bottle of water in my bag. I fished it out as I was walking, deciding to extend my kindness once again and offer it to the man. As I drew near, I noticed that he seemed smaller than I had remembered. I thought perhaps he had shrunk with age. It wasn't until I stood before him I noticed the loose, hanging sleeve swaying in the wind. Due to the absence of his left arm, I left him the bottle of water placed above a $20 bill. His gaze never waned, as if I was invisible to him. I told him to take care of himself and left. That evening stuck with me for a while. I told him to take care of himself and left. That evening stuck with me for a while. I kept wondering what had happened to the man on Briar Lane. For the next few years, I saw the man on Briar Lane in intermittences of 3 or 4 months. Whenever I would visit my family, I'd make sure to stop and check in on the man. I'd bring him something to eat and drink and always left him a $20 bill, although I wasn't sure if he ever took it. Each time I did, I grew gradually more concerned. It would start small, maybe another missing finger or a few missing teeth. Other times, I'd come back to see him missing a foot or an ear. Sometimes it's more alarming, like when they took his entire right leg, his nose, and finally his other eye. There were never any remnants of blood being spilt on Briar Lane. The man never cried for help. He just sat in contempt, slowly stripped of his flesh and being. The sleeves of his clothes hung slack, an empty reminder of what he once was. Robbed of his sense of sound, smell, and now sight, I shudder to imagine what he was left with. Alone was the man on Briar Lane, a accompanied only by the pain and longing for what was lost. Accompanied only by the pain and longing for what was lost. The sight of him was hard to ignore now. People could no longer bear to simply walk past him. Some would steal passing glances, unable to look away at the horror, as if he was a circus freak show attraction. Most don't even dare to walk through Briar Lane anymore, especially not at night when a lone street light illuminates the living corpse for all to see. Occasionally, some children on a dare would sprint down the street, fueled by the fear of the urban legend of the ghoul of Briar Lane. A decade had passed since the first time I spoke to the man. I think I'm the only one who still sees him. On several occasions, I've alerted the police and called an ambulance. They always assured me that they were on their way. I never heard the sirens, nor saw the flashing blue and red lights. I never did stop trying to get him help. I just wish I did more for him before they took too much, before they fully dismantled the man on Briar Lane. A week ago was the last time I or anybody ever saw the man on Briar Lane. What I saw prompted me to tell this story. It has been nearly 15 years since I first spoke to the man. I am now in my late 20s. The man on Briar Lane, now reduced to nothing but a torso with a head attached. Stumps remained where he once had arms and legs. His face now resembled a skull, with empty sockets and a smooth, featureless hole where his nose once was. It's gotten so bad, I find myself unable to bear the sight of what he has become. Practically a corpse, just rotting on the street, waiting for death to finally take him. Perhaps it wasn't death, but something arrived to collect. So I was out late past midnight, trying to find a secluded spot to smoke. The nosy neighbors next door had complained about the smell, so I wandered through the neighborhood in the dead of night when the idea struck me. A place where all but one avoided. I didn't plan on actually going to Briar Lane, but just close enough so that the smell wouldn't linger at a place people frequented. Yet, this sickening obsession I've had since I was a child beckoned me, and soon I found myself at Briar Lane. Something immediately felt off. Briar Lane had become so familiar to me, I instantly knew something didn't belong. I saw the man, sitting slumped beneath the spotlight of the street lamp as usual. Something just outside of the light seemed to shift in the shadows. It was a figure standing just next to the man. It was uncanny watching anyone else interact with the man on Briar Lane, especially with the grotesque state he was in. I always suspected there was someone looking out for him, feeding him and keeping him alive, although I'm not sure I would call it mercy. I kept quiet and out of view as I watched the figure. All I could make out was the dark silhouette. I'm not exactly sure why, but I felt the need to make myself scarce, as if I knew instinctively that I was intruding on something I should not have seen. I watched as the silhouette knelt down so that he was level with the man. The silhouette seemed to be speaking to the man, but I was too far to discern their conversation. I kept watching intently, holding my breath as if I would somehow improve my hearing. Suddenly, the man, as if reacting to the silhouette's words, began to violently flail. He wasn't capable of much motion, but with the mobility he had, he pushed himself onto his stomach and began to worm away from the silhouette. For the first time, I heard a sound escape the man's mouth. It was a terrible wail, a mixture of suppressed pain, anguish, and panic. It sounded inhuman, as he had all his teeth pulled and tongue severed. It was hard to watch him try desperately to flee from the figure and failing to make much progress. I still wonder if I should have intervened at that moment. I just couldn't bring myself to. I felt paralyzed by the situation and did nothing but watch as the events unfolded in front of me. A man stripped of everything with nothing left to be taken, save for his life. I could not fathom what horror could possibly frighten a man like that. That was until the figure stood back up and stepped into the spotlight. looming over the man like it was wounded prey. It was just a man. He looked to be in his 60s. He had a clean-shaven beard and piercing blue eyes. On this cold night, he was kept warm by a clean white suit under his long, dark overcoat. He wore a devious smile as he watched the man on Briar Lane wriggle and writhe. An itch perked at the back of my mind as the man's face struck of familiarity. It was a face I hadn't seen for some time, but my memory told me I had seen often before. I wrestled with the conclusion I was forced to draw, but as much as I tried to deny it, the man in the coat had the face of the man on Briar Lane. Cleaned up, with a confident aura, and an expensive attire, made it difficult to recognize him. But I did. The man in the coat simply bent down and reached outwards with his right hand, resting it on the struggling man's shoulder. The dark patch birthmark on the back of his hand erased any doubts I had left. As I strained my eyes to make out the details, I think I might have seen stitches on his skin. I continued to watch as he lifted the man off the ground with ease, cradling him like one would a child. As he held the man's struggles and screams did not cease. Like a fish out of water, the man flailed in his arms, trying hopelessly to escape his grasp. He held onto the man firmly but effortlessly. As he turned to walk down the street away from me, he stopped in his tracks. I felt my heart rise up to my throat. The fear of him having noticed me made my legs feel weak under my weight. He turned his head towards me with a faint smile drawn across his face. He had the presence of a special kind of person that you only meet a handful of times in your life, like he understood and cared. Yet this facade of his only made me feel greater unease. The uncanny sight of a smiling man holding a dismembered corpse was seared into my nightmares. Casually, while balancing the body on one arm, he reached his free hand into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper which he dropped. Like a leaf in the wind, it gently glided onto the pavement, resting perfectly where the man used to sit. With that, the two of them disappeared into the darkness of the night. The man's cries never ceased as they went, but it slowly died down to a whimper, and soon I was left alone, in silence. I wasn't sure how long it took me to work up courage to finally move. I stumbled my way down Briar Lane as my legs felt like socks stuffed with pebbles. Slowly, I moved towards the streetlight to retrieve the paper left behind. It was all that remained of the man on Briar Lane. Now, as I write this, I hold on to the tangible remnant to assure myself that I hadn't imagined what I saw. It is a $20 bill with a note attached by a paperclip. Scrawled onto the note in red ink are the words, "Remember, there once was a man here on Briar Lane." Thanks so much for making it to the end of this video. A quick thank you to my patrons: Mr. Sankofa, Austin My Love, Rinku Star, William Hartley, Cupcake Hips, Alonzo, Icy Narrates, and Jesse Hartley. I hope that everyone is having an amazing holiday. Don't forget the reason for the season. And on that note, if anybody has a prayer request, I would love to know how I can be praying for you. So go ahead and reach out to me on any of my socials, in the comments, over Instagram, anything. And also, if you're interested in becoming a patron, I have links in the description. But I also have links in the description for charities every now and then, or people who I think could really benefit from that. So if you are limited on money and you want to give to something, I'd much rather you give to them than to me, but it's ultimately up to you. Anyways, thank you guys so much, and I hope that you all have amazing, wonderful, happy holidays, and I'll see you in the next video.